Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and I trust you're safe and well wherever you are joining us from. My name's Alistair Scott-Faris, and it's my pleasure to bring this webinar here to you today, where we're going to talk about the impact of COVID on Industry 4.0. There is no doubt that Industry 4.0 and the digital transformation across industry is starting to see not just a change, but a paradigm shift into the way businesses are being operated. There is a global industry here in the trillions of dollars, but of course, nobody has envisaged in the last 10, 20 years that this sort of progress would be affected by the recent global pandemic that has and continues to affect all of us around the globe. And today's discussion is really around about how that's going to affect this digital transformation and the effect of Industry 4.0 on industry generally. And with that, it's my real pleasure to introduce to you the panel. The panel we've assembled really tries to represent a broad spectrum across industry. Firstly, Gavin Gillett. So Gavin comes to us from the largest miner globally, which is Rio Tinto, and Gavin's a member of the Pioneer Lab for Rio. And what's really exciting to me about that is they're not looking at just the new technologies for today, but also through to 2030. So I look forward to Gavin's insights there. We've also got Syed here as well. Syed is the digital practice leader for WIPRO in the Middle East. For those that don't know WIPRO, they are a behemoth, I think 180,000 employees worldwide. And Syed is certainly all things digital, particularly around the IT side. And being in the Middle East is very oil and gas centric. So again, I look forward to Syed's input. And last but certainly not least is Dr. Carla Boehl. Carla is across multiple industries, and not just multiple industries, but also across an academic and an industry exposure. Her recent role was as an innovation manager with Monadelphous, an engineering service provider across both mining and oil and gas. So again, I look forward to Carla's input into the discussion today. So Syed, I wanted to start the discussion with you, if that's okay, because although I've sort of spoken about the impact of COVID, what many people outside the oil and gas sector might not know is that the oil price has certainly seen a large impact as well. So whilst you as a digital practice leader in the Middle East is dealing with COVID and all the ramifications of that, there's also the impact of the oil price. So what are your thoughts around, what have you seen, I guess, in the first instance around that impact, and what do you see going forward? And I'm really asking more specifically around the Middle East market, because I don't know if you have that broader view across the global piece.
Yeah, sure, Alistair. So Middle East, as you know, is characteristically different. Most of the key oil companies here are national oil companies. And so the rate of adoption of digital and digitalization in these organizations are characteristically different from global oil companies. However, they had started a lot in terms of organizing themselves into structures that enable digital transformation, identifying use cases and trying out what possibilities could exist, how it can help improve their efficiency before the double whammy struck them, right? And we were anticipating that it could be a discretionary spend across all of these NOCs, and hence we would see a major stop on most of these initiatives in these organizations. But we were wrong, and we are quite surprised, and we are seeing that most of the oil companies have not stopped their digital transformation efforts. Instead, they are prioritizing this as one of the key strategic agendas of their organization of how it could actually transform the way they're working. And hence we see a number of such initiatives coming from the major NOCs here. It's happening in Saudi Arabia, it's happening even in Oman, it's happening very much in UAE and Qatar as well. Okay, in Kuwait, things are hotting up and people are looking towards that. Kuwait has been slow in adopting digital transformation, but yes, they are thinking about it and they are also doing it.
So, Syed, would it be fair to say you've seen it then almost as a catalyst to further change?
Yes, absolutely. It has actually rapidly, NOCs had been typically very guarded about their IT assets, not so open towards adopting cloud, even keeping their networks completely air-gapped and have highly secured in connecting with internet and other such services, right? Now what has happened is we are seeing increased adoption of tools such as Microsoft Teams, Azure, AWS, even agreeing to take non-critical loads to outside the country, which was completely unheard of 3-4 months back. So this has really spurred a significant change in key leadership's mind on adopting these technologies.
That's fantastic. I think that's great news. And then, so Gavin, I guess on the other side of that is from a mining perspective. So mining from a market has actually benefited from a commodity price, I think primarily driven through some of the effects of the South American producers. Have you seen, I guess, what's the operational impacts been generally with the mining operations? And then I guess more broadly, how have you seen that affecting your strategic view of sort of that innovation growth, if you like?
Yeah, it's very much having a dual impact. I think there's a whole bunch of areas where we would have spent significant capital in the past, but COVID has made it so we're a lot more short-term focused than we probably have ever been, as we try and navigate our way through probably some of the most difficult and challenging times we've seen in a generation or more. But the second component is really having a big impact on acceptance levels, which is really quite nice. So from my perspective as someone who's very, very passionate about innovation and the role that future technologies are going to have in the way we do business and the way we live our lives, the acceptance piece is the most important piece. And the example I'd like to share with that is around aviation, because aircraft have been able to take off and fly and then land themselves since the 70s. But from an acceptance perspective, the average individual is not comfortable with that. They're not comfortable with the idea of only one pilot in the cockpit. And so when it comes to something like automation, COVID is having a massive impact on people's acceptance towards remote working, towards more flexible work arrangements, towards robotics and automation technologies that we've not seen in the last 30 or 40 years. So while we've had some of the big ticket items sort of delayed until we can be a little bit more assured of the future, some of those acceptance pieces is going to pave the way for really fascinating technologies to come into the workplace that will make a significant step change in the way we do business, in the way where we can be safer, in the way we can do it more environmentally friendly. Where in the past we probably didn't have as much room to talk about those things because continuing to do the status quo was a lot more was easier, really. And as humans, we can be a little bit lazy and take the path of least resistance. So this has forced us to change and adapt and try some new things to continue being successful.
And so, Gavin, when you talk about that acceptance, do you think that's being driven through a lack of other options? Is this really, now that we had the back up against the wall, it was really mandated around this remote working piece, limited resource allocation, both on site and at home? Is that been that driver? And I think maybe that what's tipped everything to now say, actually, this is something we can accept?
Yeah, I think it was very much fear-based. I think a lot of industries around the world, including my own, realised that we had all our eggs in one basket, and something as significant as a COVID event could make it so you don't have access to those eggs anymore. There was a very real potential that this could have impacted my industry much more significantly than it has. We were very proactive at mitigating those risks, and we were very quick, and we had a lot of that on the back of our experience from dealing with SARS and MERS and swine flu in the past. And so we had a little bit of a game plan that we could deploy very quickly, and we're probably one of the few industries that has continued to grow through COVID, despite having to change our operational model a little bit to be able to do that. But it's really quite a difficult thing to gauge, because being a global player as we are, the COVID is impacting different regions in different ways. And for big companies like ours to be successful, we centralize and try and standardize, and that doesn't necessarily work in all areas. So it's a little bit of a unique problem that in some areas we're thriving, in other areas we're struggling. But for the most part, we're able to keep our people safe, which is our number one priority. And two, we can start getting a little bit of traction with some really exciting innovation to build on for the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, from my observations, I think that safety culture that carries through both oil and gas and mining generally has certainly carried those industries to a relatively safe place, if I can reuse that term, because these processes and systems have allowed the injection, as you said, from SARS, and I think even just general sort of health and safety practice within these operating sites. So yeah, I completely concur. Carla, you're sort of now sitting between these two gentlemen, which is why I'm so pleased to have you on the panel, and recently been working with a business which is across both mining and oil and gas. I'd be interested to just hear from you on your observations, if there are any differences between the application and integration of technology and digitisation into these sectors. Do you see it across? Is it fair to be comparing sectors? Should we be doing that from a company level, from a global level? What were your thoughts on someone who's now had a foot in both camps, if I could use that term?
Yes, thanks. Yes, we can compare, definitely, and we can learn from each other. Both industries can learn. What's happening now with the COVID and the crisis and so on, actually both industries are on the same boat, and both have shifted their focus away from innovation during the crisis. So prior to the crisis, a number of executives were interviewed about their thoughts about innovation and digitization and so on. And before COVID, most of them would say that is the number one or the number two priority, the digital transformation. All of those things were priority. And for example, I've got these figures from a consultancy. 60% of executives who were interviewed in technology and engineering industries would say innovation was their number one priority. During COVID, it went to 20%. Other industries like financial services, 50% of the executives would say innovation was the number one. It went down to 10%. And then if you think of retail, then retail, 40% of the executives were in that situation. It went down to 5% or less. So yeah, in summary, COVID and the crisis have had a negative impact in innovation, which is sad. Some reports I've read, are really saying that companies now in these industries, oil and gas and mining, are really focusing on efficiency, organizational health, really refocusing on their core business instead of innovation. Yet history suggests that companies that invest in innovation through a crisis outperform peers during the recovery. And there's lots of research and figures and numbers on this. So innovators outperform their peers during the crisis as well. They also outperform the market by 30% past the crisis in those years after the crisis. So yeah, some lessons learned in here. It's not the first time that an epidemic affects the markets and these industries. And my view is that by not focusing on innovation, these industries are missing out.
So I mean, that's really interesting to me, Carla. So really what you're saying is that, innovation has been shown that, for companies within a crisis, should they be innovating, they're actually not only going to better their peers during that, but see a 30% growth after. So once they actually emerge from the market, which sounds to me, circling back to Syed's position and where his view of the Middle East market is exactly what they're doing, that they're actually looking to innovate to then perhaps position themselves amongst the market. Is that what you see, Syed? I mean, I think that's a really interesting point from Carla. Do you think this is a strategic move generally to say we're going to maintain our strategic direction, we're going to actually put more weight behind these digital transformations? Is that what you're seeing? I think you're on mute, Syed.
Yeah, yes. So characteristically, the market here in Middle East is different, as I explained, and the rate of adoption had just recently started about 18 to 24 months before, and the impetus on moving to the digital transformation was just at the adoption phase, and hence what has happened is. They were just about to start innovating using digital technologies, and this happened, right? So this has really accelerated adopting these technologies. So people who did not allow their employees to work from home are actually have to do that right now.
Which I think was Gavin's point. Yeah, that's right.
So this is actually, for us here in Middle East, it is actually pushing companies to innovate more and more, adopt and be at the same level as how others are, perhaps global companies, and then start from there. So we see it as pandemic and the low oil price is really pushing oil companies to adopt most of these technologies which are spurring digital transformation.
Yeah, I think that's excellent, because I think certainly news globally around the impact to oil and gas companies has certainly been quite evident, I think, and that's probably not just COVID, but more the oil price, I think. So it is nice to hear a good story where, businesses are maintaining that strategic growth and application despite the current economic and social and health environment. Gavin, I mean, to me, this kind of talks to what Carla was talking about, is really that cultural and leadership piece, because ultimately, this is about culture and about how you drive change, and what the effect of in this case, COVID and other economic triggers may change that leadership and that cultural focus. So is that something that the Pioneer Lab looks at, and how do you look to integrate beyond just your bubble of the Pioneer Lab, if I could use that term, into sort of more of the leadership and management of the broader business? Because it's a big business you're trying to affect.
Yeah, so it's absolutely something the Pioneer Lab looks into really quite carefully, and we've come across some really interesting sort of challenges, I guess, when shifting the culture, because we're probably hitting some of the human limits of being able to take in information, and so from that cultural piece, one of the things that we're sort of envisioning for the future is machine learning assisted decision-making processes, where perhaps the humans are less about filtering all the information on their own, and we're going to have to look at a culture that sort of trusts the information when they don't have all the bits and pieces to it. If that makes a lot of sense. I'm trying to make something that's quite complicated very simple, but one of the interesting things that we're looking at with machine learning is being able to take enormous amounts of data and filter that through so that you're given, as a leader in our business, a selection of options that are all going to have a positive impact is the ultimate goal. And you, using your human-based instincts and your career knowledge and your background, will choose which one of those 4 or more options is the best out of the best possible options. And that's going to need really quite a large culture shift, because as all people all around the world, you have different personalities. You've got leaders that like to micromanage. You've got leaders that like to have all the information before they make a decision. And then you've got other leaders that are more willing to take a risk and jump. And so fundamentally changing how leaders interact with data is part of the cultural puzzle beyond sort of 2030 that we need to start to realise. and that comes with multiple aspects where taking all that data and filtering to what's most useful is also going to be a big part of the cultural piece. So it's a multifaceted challenge to tackle the information, the level and the amount of information that we have hitting us every day, because we think part of the atrophy that we're seeing globally, whether it's in politics or in business or elsewhere, is really about the human capacity to absorb all that data and make effective decisions, because we already know psychologically that the more options you're given in life, the less satisfied you are with the outcomes of those options, and the less able you're to make informed decisions on them. So it's an interesting problem that we're looking to solve.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the information piece, and then even something as fundamental as just having a WebEx discussion and these cyber meetings rather than physical meetings, I think it's really started to challenge what is that cultural approach of having to sit down and people, be them at work or at home, to affect an outcome. And there is no doubt there's been some changes there because the option's been taken away. I completely agree. So, Carla, back to you. What are your thoughts around affecting change? You kind of highlighted what are some of the negative effects of leadership in these circumstances. So what is your messaging to these executives around holding the course, similar to what it sounds like Syed's market's seeing in the Middle East? What do you think are the key metrics or processes we need to put in place in these leadership teams, I assume, to start to right the ship?
Yes. Well, number one, really, and always the focus, your customers. So rediscover your customers, evolve the business model. That's the main things. And of course, focus on innovation. How can you refocus on innovation? Identify the most valuable problems to solve. Number one. Number two, realign to the new normal. And third one, rapidly innovate at the right scale with the right partnerships. So that's my advice.
So can you give me a little bit more detail on your third point there around the right scale and the right speed? Is that the fail fast type theory? Is that what you're alluding to there?
Yes, you can say it's the fast fail approach. We have moved on from the traditional approach to an agile approach, isn't it? So the traditional thinking instead of doing, don't fail. Now, it's part of the past, isn't it? Fast and fail has become the priority for companies that want to innovate, right, and to be successful and leaders in the market. Particularly in the case of oil and gas and mining industries, which are asset intensive, where maintenance is a huge cost for these industries, specifically to focus on maintenance strategies and tactics, improving asset reliability, developing strategic relationships with suppliers, and of course, data and reporting across the value chain.
Yeah, absolutely. A question then back to you, Gavin, briefly. All businesses have been, I guess, in a level of triage, certainly in the early days of COVID, just purely because of the operational impacts of the pandemic. How are you now looking to get, or do you have any challenge with getting the messaging up to that executive level around how you're pushing different projects through? Because it's interesting for me that Syed is saying they're at the table and they're having those discussions, and they seem to be relatively, if anything, there's been a catalyst to change in Syed's sector, if I haven't misquoted you, Syed, there. And so, Gavin, for you, have you found that you've had to change your communication level to be able to get in there? Because everybody, certainly in that leadership position, has been busier, haven't they? I mean, everyone had a list of items which weren't on the list before. So have you had to change that tact from a communication perspective?
Yeah, quite a bit actually, because you're absolutely right. The executive leaders are busier than ever, and you know they're sort of running from one crisis to the other, and so only being able to take in the high level details it makes it very difficult to sort of get into the weeds a little bit and discuss things at a deeper level. So the sort of tactic that we're tending to use is to building up the cadence. So shorter amount of time with our executive committee, but we're trying to build up the cadence, and we're also utilising the senior leadership team quite significantly now. So in the past, where you might start at the executive committee and they would sort of instruct the senior leadership teams to do the work. Now we're sort of starting at the senior leadership teams and just beginning the work where we're very confident that there is alignment with the company objective as best we can, because yeah, their time is incredibly short at the moment as they're moving from sort of one bleeding wound to another throughout COVID. However, it is significantly better now than it was in the first month or 2 months. You can already see the breathing room has started. Everyone's sort of relaxing into what is possibly the new norm, or at very least. I don't think
we'll ever have business as usual now. It will be the new normal. That is most certainly true.
Yeah, and we're possibly a lot more comfortable now that we understand what the implications of COVID are going to be for our supply chain logistics, for our sites, for our people, for flights. You know, we move 30,000 a month through air transportation, and so yeah, there's some significant impacts on our business that we weren't sure how that was going to play out in the first month or two. So we've got a little bit more confidence on that now and understanding it and mitigation to make it so it can operate.
It's fantastic. And I think, so Syed, for you on an operational level, we've sort of spoken about the Middle East market and, you know, your interaction with your clients. But can I ask, WIPRO is such an enormous business from, you know, an FTE perspective. Do you see some change occurring on the operational manner within WIPRO generally? So more of that introspective view rather than the client facing? Do you see, for example, more WebEx type meetings, and do you see more flexible work arrangements coming from COVID?
Yeah, so most of our staff in Middle East is working from home, and we are seeing an increased productivity in that mode.
That's fantastic.
People who are actually delivering to customers, customers have also created mechanism by which they can start working from home as well. So most of our staff at this moment, none of them are hardly coming to office. Only a few people required to sustain the office are there. For example, IT support, etc. But we are basically all working from home. Most of our interaction with our customers are happening over WebEx, and that way, customers are also welcoming those meetings rather than in person or in their office, because they're also working from home. So this really has made the interaction with customers, discussing it a lot easier and a lot productive actually.
I mean, I really like that to close off the discussion actually, because it circles back to Gavin's original point around the fact that, you know, we've had a lot of options removed from us now on just generally the way we work, and, you know, in a lot of cases, businesses and our operational practices, we've had our back up against the wall. But when you start to get that objective evidence to say that this new normal is actually more efficient or more productive, it takes away that fear piece. Is that, Gavin, something that you'd see from that acceptance level, that if you start to build up the evidence behind these changes, that's where you can really see the change? And I guess to Carla's point, if you can't make that change, you don't get the evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been a big eye-opener for our business. Prior to COVID, we wouldn't have dreamed that having 90% of our workforce at home would have been successful. There was, you know, probably a little bit of a perception that everyone would be on Netflix with their feet up, having a fat time. And what happened instead is everyone really got stuck into what needed to be done. and performed brilliantly. And I think the executive group are really quite proud of the way people are reacted to COVID and continue to react to COVID, and so they're a lot more open as a result to exploring very flexible work arrangements, new digital technologies, and new opportunities that perhaps before we would have considered a little bit more risky or unappetizing.
Yeah, risk has certainly taken on a whole new discussion point now, hasn't it, within business? That's absolutely right. Well, we're out of time. I really sincerely like to thank all of you. So, Gavin, thank you so much. I think your insights and where the business is at is fantastic. Syed, it's really nice to hear from the Middle East that, in fact, the change is affecting you guys positively, which is, I think, something that should be setting a precedent globally. I really like that. And Carla, thank you always for your insights. I think I'd love to hear a little bit more around what we can do to affect this change. And I'm sure your leadership in the industry and sector will maintain us on that trajectory. So, look, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And I've got a few questions here online from participants that I'll forward you separately. But thank you so much. And I will talk to each of you again soon.
Beautiful. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.